Today we are joined by Dr. Stephen Kent, Dr. Maryam Razavy, and Professor Phil Lord. Dr. Stephen Kent is a sociology professor and an adjunct professor in the interdisciplinary program of religious studies at the University of Alberta. He teaches courses and publishes on alternative and sectarian religions. His articles have appeared in such diverse journals as the Rutgers Journal of Law and Religion, Utah Law Review, Philosophy East and West, and Aggression and Violent Behavior. His 2001 book, From Slogans to Mantras, was selected by Choice Current Reviews for Academic Libraries as an outstanding academic title for 2002. In 2012, Stephen received the Margaret Singer Award at the ICSA Annual Conference. Dr. Maryam Razavy holds a dual PhD in sociology and religious studies. She is a researcher at the University of Alberta in the Department of Sociology as well as within the Department of Family Medicine. Her primary research interests are religion and violence, extremist religious traditions, and impacts of cultural health and healing. Phil Lord is an assistant professor at Lakehead University's Boer-Alaskan Faculty of Law. He was when appointed at age 24 and remains the youngest law professor in Canada. Phil previously served as an instructor at Carleton University's Department of Law and a law clerk at the Federal Court of Canada. Phil graduated from the McGill Faculty of Law with degrees in Civil and Common Law, on the Dean's Honors List, and with the highest standing in property law and constitutional law. He subsequently pursued an LLM as a Bombardier Scholar. Phil is called to the bar in New York, Massachusetts, and Quebec. Phil has authored over 20 academic articles, most peer-reviewed. His research focuses on public law, principally employment and taxation law, behavioral economics, and new religious movements. Today they're going to talk to us about religious fraud and forgery.
Hello and thanks for coming to our talk on religious fraud and forgery. I'm Steve Kent. I'm a retired professor. I will be providing an initial overview of religious fraud and examples throughout history. The second presenter is Dr. Maryam Razavy. Dr. Razavy has a joint PhD in both sociology and religious studies. She will be talking about financial fraud in religion. The third speaker is Phil Lord, who is both a university professor and a practicing lawyer. Phil will be talking about issues concerning the law and fraud. Quick definition: fraud is essentially deception. It's done either for personal gain or collective gain to benefit one's group, or done to damage another person or another group. It's almost always intentional, but some fraud can be compulsive. Think about George Santos. He is a member of the House of Representatives from New York who seems to be a compulsive liar, and he can't control himself. He would be an example almost certainly of a compulsive fraudster. Forgery is a kind of fraud. It's the production of anything, a text, a work of art, a painting, or whatnot, and attributing the creation of that item to a famous person who in fact didn't create it. So it's the attribution of a false creatorial claim about something produced. Affinity fraud comes up a lot in this presentation, as well as the presentation by Maryam and Phil. Affinity fraud occurs when the fraudster is either a member of a group or claims to be a member of the group. Fraudster works him or herself into the group and gets their trust. Once the fraudster earns or essentially has the group's trust, the fraudster can start deceiving members, claiming to be able to make good investments on their behalf with high returns, essentially to draw people into what almost always are Ponzi schemes. How extensive was religious fraud in the ancient world? Well, it's fairly common. We have 52 texts extant right now from the ancient world of what are called the pseudepigrapha. The pseudepigrapha were clearly fraudulent manuscripts attributed to characters in the Hebrew Bible. When rabbis codified the Hebrew Bible, they just rejected these texts because they were manufactured attempts. We also have 14 additional texts that straddle Judaism and the pagan world. The Jewish scholars would be challenged by pagans on certain points. They wouldn't have an answer in their scriptures, so sometimes they made up text to provide responses to the challenges they were facing. Same pattern happened in the early Christian world. A famous current New Testament scholar, Bart Ehrman, was an evangelical Christian who undertook New Testament studies. He essentially talked himself out of his faith because he found so much fraud and forgery in early Christian text, to the point that he argues that at least 11 of the 27 New Testament books are forgeries. So, for example, even the basic claim that Jesus' disciples wrote the Gospels is almost certainly not true. Ehrman points out that the disciples were illiterate. They could not read or write. Moreover, a lot of early Christians were in theological battles with Jews and pagans, and just like some Jewish rabbis did, if opponents ask a question or challenge Christianity on a particular point, and the Christian scriptures didn't have an answer, some Christian leaders just made up texts that provided answers. Here's the most consequential New Testament forgery I can think of. It's from Paul's letters to the Corinthians, and in that letter, Paul supposedly wrote, "Women should keep silence in the churches." Well, in an earlier section of Corinthians, Paul said, "Any woman who prays or prophesies with her head unveiled dishonors her head." Now, what these two passages suggest is that first, there were women speaking in churches, and there are many other New Testament passages to reinforce that interpretation. Presumably, therefore, somebody in the churches did not like the roles that women were assuming in many early Christian contexts. So the person made up a passage saying that women should remain silent. It got accepted as part of a letter that Paul wrote and became a Christian doctrine that's had dramatic and damaging implications for the roles of women for centuries in various Christian traditions. Authentic fakes. These are interesting. These are clearly manufactured texts that people nonetheless accept to be true. The Gnostic Gospels are probably the best example of authentic fakes. They were written from the 2nd to the 4th centuries in the Common Era. They often had authorship attributed to biblical figures, of course. Paul, James, John, Mary Magdalene. Women played prominent roles in many of the Gnostic Gospels and so on. We have over 52 of them, and the basic claim is that a difference existed between spirit versus matter. They were very dualistic in their cosmological conceptions. They competed with early Christianity, but they were eventually suppressed successfully by early Christianity. But because they were followers and believers, some of their doctrines had been widely disseminated. Some of the doctrines influenced the Mandean communities. The Mandean communities still exist. There's about 70,000 of them worldwide. They were based in Iran and Iraq, but because of war in the Middle East, they're now dispersed throughout the world. Here's an example of the Mandean community carrying on a baptism ritual based upon their scriptures that were influenced by the Gnostics. Modern examples of ancient fakes. Classic instance involving fake, not manuscripts, but Christian artifacts and items involve the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. The head of the Museum of the Bible is the owner of the large business in the states called Hobby Lobby. Hobby Lobby does arts and crafts and so on. There's about 28,000 employees in the United States for Hobby Lobby. So it's a big business. And in the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., the owner was grabbing everything he could that shed any light on the Hebrew Bible Old Testament or the Christian New Testament. Consequently, when 16 Dead Sea Scroll fragments came on the market, he snatched them up. Turns out they were all fake. But look at what else Hobby Lobby had got itself involved in. In 2019, it had to return 5,000 papyri to Egypt, 6,500 clay relics to Iraq, and then earlier in 2017, had to return 3,500 antiquities to Iraq in a smuggling case settlement. Hobby Lobby's evangelical Christians were driven to establish the absolute authority and reliability of the Bible. Consequently, this drive made them susceptible targets for fraudsters and, for that matter, for smugglers. In the case of fraudulent materials going to Hobby Lobby, we see what clearly was a fraud against religion. The most famous fraud against religion is one that you probably have heard of. It happened in Mormonism. Mark Hoffman was a very skilled forger. He forged a lot of documents claiming to be from the earliest days of Mormonism and some from early periods in American history. Then he got scared. Some people are starting to question the authenticity of some of those documents, and Hoffman's solution was to start killing his private customers, people to whom he had sold these frauds. In October 1985, he had managed to bomb 2 of his former customers. And then, in his third bombing attempt, the bomb went off in the front seat of his car. It wounded him severely, but the bomb blast on his body allowed authorities to realize that he had the bomb in his car on the front seat, that he was behind the bombings. He got arrested, he got convicted of murder and fraud, and he's still in prison. Here's a picture of what his car looked like. I do not know how he ever survived, but here's his car. Another fraud, fairly contemporary one, happened in 2012. A Harvard affinity professor had devoted a career to looking at the role of women in early Christianity. A fragment came, apparently an old manuscript fragment, came on the market in which Jesus referred to "my wife." Well, this divinity professor was all over that fragment, claiming that it reinforced or verified claims she'd been making in scholarship for years. Turned out it was fake. Her susceptibility to fraud occurred because it reinforced her research and personal bias. A lot of frauds involving relics. So there's bones of martyrs and apostles. Even in the medieval period, there were apparently fragments from the cross on which Jesus was crucified. And then there's garments that holy people, martyrs, apostles, and so on wore. And even relics that were in the vicinity of holy people, relics that they had touched, and so on. Here's a picture of one relic, a first-class relic. The head of John the Baptist. Well, maybe not, but clearly, if you look at the ornamentation for it, some people venerated it as legitimate. Shroud of Turin, of course, is the most famous and controversial relic involving Christianity. I read the conclusion by a researcher who had investigated the shroud, and he said that he was 60% convinced the Shroud of Turin was fake. It wasn't from the time of Jesus, it was from the medieval period. 60% sure it was fake. Then he was also 40% convinced that it was real. Recent frauds, however, I've identified trickery, plagiarism, credentials frauds, and healing claims. Trickery. Trickery, the most famous, somewhat modern example is from spiritualism, happened in the 19th century, late 1840s. Two sisters claimed to be able to receive messages from dear departed loved ones. They had the ability, I don't know how they had this ability, but they had the ability to crack their toes. They go up on stages and auditoriums, start these seances, and then various times in the performance, loud bangs would occur throughout the auditorium. Well, the bangs were the sisters cracking their toes. This spiritualist movement took off, but by the early 1900s, there had been hundreds of spiritualist seances and mediums who had been exposed as frauds. The spiritualist assumptions, however, and patterns became the basis for the New Age channeling movement. Great picture. This picture didn't give me an exact date, but here are spiritualists doing a seance, and notice they've managed to elevate the table off the floor. I don't know how they did that, but you should know that one of the major debunkers of seances, of spiritualism, was the famous magician Harry Houdini. Plagiarism. I just chose Eckankar because the examples were so egregious. It's a group still operating today that claims to provide spiritual freedom and the direct path of God through the teachings of the living Eckmaster. Those teachings provide people with the skills to soul travel to higher realms of consciousness. Well, one of the books that Twitchell claimed was a dictation from a Tibetan master had an academic and his associates discover over 400 plagiarized paragraphs. Credentials fraud. For example, Scientologist L. Ron Hubbard. He claimed at various times that he was a civil engineer and a PhD. He had actually either dropped out of college or was kicked out for bad grades. He had no university credentials, no university degrees whatsoever. The credentials fraud that appears in the Unification Church is interesting because it involves these religious leaders getting honorary degrees and professoriates from schools that grant them without the religious figure having to go through all the suffering and pain of writing a dissertation, taking courses, passing the defense, and so on. Reverend Moon called himself Reverend. A lot of his followers called him Reverend Doctor. He actually had what looks to me like just a 2-year engineering degree, and he had no theological training. He was not a reverend. And you heard me make the slip a second ago. I, for years, referred to Reverend Moon. He's not a reverend. He's got no theological training. He does, however, have 8 honorary doctorates. And 2 of those honorary doctorates were from schools that the Unification Church owned. His surviving wife, Hak Jahan Moon, has officials calling her Dr. Moon. She's a high school degree, but she has 8 honorary doctorates from the same schools as did her late husband. Now get ready for this one. Credentials fraud by Soka Gakkai's Daisaku Akita. I call it credentials fraud, but he's got degrees from 386 honorary degrees and professoriates from schools around the world, even though he only studied political science at a junior college. Didn't have any upper level degrees, but he's got all these honorary degrees that allows him, so he feels, and some of his followers to call him Dr. Akita. Credentials fraud with televangelists, of course, is very widespread. I found at least 13 prominent TV preachers who had honorary degrees and had been awarded PhDs from paper mills. One of the paper mills turned out to be Oral Roberts University. In 2019, I found a list of over 60 paper mills providing degrees in the United States. Healing fraud. Big study done by skeptics inside the area of Houston, Texas, Southern California, San Francisco, and so on. They conducted careful studies of healing claims made by preachers, and they found not one example of an organic disease healed. These healing preachers were just lying about their healing abilities. Why does fraud happen so often in religion? Well, one of the reasons, it's a basic one, is that religion provides meaning, order, and community to many people. Consequently, religious people accept the claims of their leaders, and they trust others who are of the same faith. Critics, therefore, get interpreted to be enemies. Trust develops within these religious communities, and people accept doctrines and beliefs that reinforce this trust. Social psychologists refer to this process as selective reinforcement. With the advent of science, many religious leaders wanted to increase their status by claiming high-level, what appear to be academic degrees. And religion, of course, is based upon faith, not critical testing. Consequently, it is inherently susceptible to fraud. Thanks very much. Please stay around for Dr. Razavy's presentation.
Thank you, Professor Kent. My name is Maryam Razavy. I hold a joint PhD in sociology and religion from the University of Alberta, and today I'll be speaking to you about financial fraud in religions. As demonstrated by the discussions on this panel, there is no shortage of examples when it comes to fraud amongst religious traditions. But perhaps the most prevalent form of fraud is that of financial misconduct. As this presentation will briefly discuss, religious organizations and institutions provide really the perfect setting for both the collection as well as the mismanagement of funds. Consider, for instance, the following example. A man of self-professed spirituality who sits at the helm of a multi-billion-dollar financial empire. Contrary to the popular depiction of the religious guru who's unconcerned with worldly, material possessions, Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, who also went by Osho, broke that stereotype in really the most spectacular fashion. The spiritual leader, who was known nonetheless for his fleet of 85 Rolls Royces, gained a popular following in the 1970s and 80s for his various teachings on meditation, personal transformation, and sexual liberation. In the late 1980s, Rajneesh and his followers purchased a large ranch in rural Oregon, which they developed into a type of self-sustaining commune called Rajneeshpuram. Now, this commune would attract thousands of followers from around the world, and these followers would often pay upwards of $5,000 apiece just as an admission fee, followed by a monthly membership of roughly $500 for the privilege of volunteering their time at the commune. To further finance their operations, the group began soliciting investments from its followers, promising high returns on their money. However, many of these investments were fraudulent and no one ever really saw any returns. The group also engaged in money laundering as well as other financial frauds to conceal these crimes. As one ex-follower reported, senior officials at Rajneeshpuram, quote, cajoled and browbeat those present to contribute every last possible dime from their own resources or from family or friends to the Rajneesh treasury. Now, such objectionable practices that are essentially built on the back of financial donations and fees from devotees have led leading cult expert Adrian Greek to describe Rajneeshism as a slave system with an aristocracy at the top that receives most of the benefits. Unfortunately, this case that I have just very simply outlined here is neither novel nor uncommon. Cases of financial fraud within religious organizations exist globally and across practically every type of religious group. Now, Professor Kent has already defined financial fraud, but I will just review it very quickly here. Financial fraud is a rather broad umbrella term that covers many types of fraud, including identity theft, Ponzi schemes, tax embezzlement, investment fraud, as well as others. The financial fraud most often seen amongst religious organizations, however, is defined more accurately as affinity fraud. Affinity fraud refers to a type of scam where fraudsters exploit a common affiliation or shared identity with the victim. This common identity can be based on religion, ethnicity, nationality, even things such as one's profession or social status, essentially any characteristic that creates a sense of community or belonging. Those who commit affinity fraud are typically group members or leaders who spend a great period of time cultivating trust from other members, only to later exploit that relationship through the theft or misappropriation of funds. While affinity fraud can occur anywhere, those cases occurring within religious organizations are of particular note due in part to their sheer scale. So, for instance, Bernie Madoff's considerable Ponzi scheme, in which investors lost nearly $20 billion, revealed a mostly Jewish clientele. Reed Slatkin used his connections in the Church of Scientology to defraud investors out of more than $600 million. And in Utah, where roughly 60% of the population belongs to the Mormon Church, the FBI is investigating $2 billion worth of affinity fraud. In fact, according to Brotherhood Mutual Insurance, fraud in churches alone, so here we're not talking about any other type of religious organization, this is just the Christian churches in the United States, is expected to reach $100 billion by 2025. And it's important to note that these numbers are more than likely undervalued, as many cases of affinity fraud in religious groups unfortunately go unreported. Financial losses aside, however, perhaps a more critical issue is that not only does financial fraud violate the trust of those who have been deceived, but it can also damage an individual's trust in an institution that often dictates things such as morality and ethics in one's life. So when the very people that have held a place of sacred importance in one's life betray an individual, the effects can be rather catastrophic, not only in one's worldview and belief system, but also for public confidence in general. Therefore, in addition to great financial losses, victims of religiously based affinity fraud must also deal with the psychological impacts of such deceitful acts. So why do we see so many acts of affinity fraud occur within religious organizations and groups? On the surface, it's seemingly incongruous that theft and embezzlement occur within those very groups whose primary purpose, supposedly, is the instruction of integrity and ethics. In reality, however, those who wish to commit affinity fraud have, in religion, the perfect command center to undertake their pursuits. As I will outline, several key traits to religious belief systems and organizations make these establishments the perfect place to conduct acts of financial fraud. So to begin, the first is expectation and obligation in religious doctrine and organizations. Religious doctrine often expects financial contributions from adherents. This can come in the form of a Christian tithe, for instance, a Sikh das fund, an Islamic zakat, Buddhist and Hindu dana, just to name a few. Believers often donate money. At times, the religion decrees a specific amount. Sometimes it's up to the parishioner, often with the assumption that the funds go to general charity, the maintenance and upkeep of the house of worship, to maintain the livelihood of religious leaders or monks, or to some auxiliary assistance program that the organization may be involved in. Some religious traditions have specific textual evidence that demands financial bestowments to the needy and the destitute. So in the case of the Christian tradition, for instance, some leaders may point to Malachi 3:8, where Christians are told that they rob God when they fail to give a tithe and offering. Quote, "You are cursed with a curse, for you are robbing me, the whole nation of you. Bring the full tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house, and thereby put me to the test, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open the windows of heaven for you and pour down for you a blessing until there is no more need." Further driving this idea behind the importance of donating financially to the Christian church is the idea that God blesses one's faith in the form of material wealth. The implication here is that one's financial problems may stem explicitly from one's lack of faith. This belief finds its roots in what's commonly referred to today as the prosperity gospel. And the prosperity gospel is really an umbrella term for a group of ideas that is popular with charismatic preachers in the evangelical tradition. And this concept essentially connects proper faith conduct with one's material financial success. Central to the prosperity gospel is the idea that giving money to the church is actually an investment. As the infamous preacher Ken Copeland stated in his book, Laws of Prosperity, quote, "Do you want 100-fold return on your money? Give and let God multiply it back to you. No bank in the world offers this kind of return. Praise the Lord." This belief in investing in the church for return is one that the infamous Benny Hinn has long preached. Hinn is a California-based preacher and at the helm of a televangelism ministry that takes in roughly $100 million a year, and who himself has a reported individual net worth of approximately $60 million. Hinn has no formal religious training per se, but he has long used his charismatic showmanship to preach this prosperity gospel. He encourages his followers to donate, asserting that giving to God is the secret to unlocking financial blessings. In 2017, a report by the Trinity Foundation, which is a religious watchdog group, alleged that Hinn engaged in a number of financial improprieties, including siphoning off millions of dollars in donations for personal use, making false promises of healing to solicit donations, as well as using his ministry's private jet for personal travel. Just as a side note, in defending his allegations, Hinn justified assets such as his private plane as a necessity and not necessarily a luxury, asserting that if he flew commercial, he would wear out trying to get God's word around the world. It should also be noted that U.S. Senate committees have investigated his ministry together with other prosperity gospel revivalists, questioning this incredibly lavish lifestyle that is often led by their leaders, albeit with no charges ever being laid. And I'm sure that Professor Lord will speak a little bit more to the legal implications of such acts. The expectations of monetary donations that certain religious edicts place on their faithful and the personal desire of parishioners to donate to the cause of their faith often results in the influx of large sums of money into these establishments, which requires both accounting as well as management. This in turn takes us to the next key trait of religious organizations, which leaves them open to affinity fraud, and that is the lack of oversight and financial controls. More often than not, large amounts of money come flowing into these organizations on a weekly basis, and it is often left to volunteers and or upper management to do the financial accounting. In smaller groups, monies are often donated straight to the leader of the group, who alone is responsible for its handling. But in larger organizations, monies are collected and counted by a group of volunteers. Institutions such as the Catholic Church have their own internal financial controls and audits, albeit not always historically transparent, while smaller, more local nonprofit organizations such as churches, mosques, temples, and so forth have, as one critic puts it, quote, a reputation for having poor internal controls and for being slow to adopt sound business and accounting practices. This lack of internal accounting and transparency, in turn, leads to greater opportunity for embezzlement. So, in an example of poor bookkeeping, in the Sikh religious community, members are encouraged to make monetary donations for the purpose of maintaining the religious center as well as for running their free food program known as Langar. In 2003, the president of the Guru Nanak Sikh Gurdwara in Surrey, BC, alleged that when there was a leadership turnover at the temple, there were lots of missing financial documents. And despite the fact that the institution, with its, I believe it's over 30,000 now plus members, had a large influx of monetary donations, roughly $22,000 weekly, the temple was not only run down, but it was also heavily mortgaged. These lack of financial records, together with poor bookkeeping of temple funds, led the new leadership to believe that these donations had actually been diverted out of the country towards financing the creation of a Sikh independent homeland in India. So far we've covered expectation and obligation and lack of financial oversight. A third key trait that makes religious organizations susceptible to fraud is the environment of trust that is present within these groups. Now, trust plays a key role in cases of affinity fraud, but it takes on a special significance when it comes to cases involving religious groups. This is in no small part due to religion's repute as a system of understanding that entails a particular value system. This value system, in turn, is largely composed of this ostensible connection with a sacred realm, as well as a code of conduct, which, for the most part, often includes standards of ethics, morality, and righteousness, just to name a few. As such, individuals who might otherwise be quite financially savvy in their day-to-day lives may approach religiously based investments and donations with a different type of mindset. Spending time within a religious organization and among members all prescribing to a similar belief system can cultivate an impression that the people within the group are, quote, good, decent, and trustworthy. In fact, as research indicates, identifying with persons who have similar characteristics and connections, such as members of a particular faith, is a strong motivation to regard those persons more favorably. As Perry and Brody explore in their research, quote, the optics of identifiable characteristics and affiliations creates the dynamic of inuring moral, trustworthy traits on an individual that may or may not exist. In religious settings, victims often have a hard time believing that someone from within their very own community would take from them, particularly and especially when the offender portrays him or herself as a religious individual and a person of high moral standards. Consider, again, the case of Philip Riel. Riel, who was a Pennsylvania businessman and a member of the Mennonite community, cheated members of the Mennonite and Amish community out of roughly $60 million. In a written response to the case, U.S. Attorney William McSwain stated, quote, the people who invested their money, sometimes their entire life savings with Philip Riel, believed implicitly that they could trust him because he was one of their own. Riel preyed upon that trust, swindling them out of tens of millions of dollars, end quote. Additionally, victims believe that when they are investing or donating in a religious setting, the money is often not only being given in the name of a higher being, but that it is going towards something tangibly beneficial for the community or for society at large. This sentiment is echoed in the 2005 report of findings of a survey of public trust and confidence in charities, which found that, quote, the main factor that drives this trust is the inherent belief that money that is contributed to them, so religious organizations, will be spent wisely and effectively. In churches, this belief is grounded in faith rather than in any rationally based expectation. This high level of trust makes churches particularly vulnerable to fraud. Trust amongst organizations, religious organizations, can exist amongst members of the organization, but at many times it is the key authority figure that garners members' trust within the group and carries out the fraud. As evidenced by research in social psychology, authority figures are notable since, as humans, we are naturally conditioned to respond to them without really questioning their validity or trying to verify their claims. These authority figures are people who hold positions of power. They often have these larger than life personas. They are highly charismatic. And in some cases, because of their self proclaimed connection to some sacred entity, they garner unparalleled levels of trust and compliance from other community members. In an example illustrating the power of an authority figure, there is the case of Sandosh Madhvan, who was a self-styled guru. Madhvan duped roughly 20 Indian nationals into giving him investment money for a charity organization. Now, inevitably, 3 underage girls reported him to authorities on charges of rape, but he was eventually charged with fraud and possession of narcotics, rape, as well as other things. Despite the charges, however, some Hindu disciples believed that he should have been left alone because, quote, Swamis are considered by the faithful to be above the law. So here we see just how important a role an authority figure can play in swaying the minds of parishioners. And the fallout does not end there. Typically, affinity fraud cases take a rather long time to play out because often, owing to the strong bonds of trust that have been established, victims don't believe right away when they have been defrauded. This is especially true when perpetrators have represented themselves as religious individuals sent from some higher authority to bequeath wealth unto others, such as in the case of some prosperity gospel preachers. Even when they do come to realize that they have been misled, they are less likely to report the fraud to authorities. Accounting fraud experts estimate that as much as 95% of fraud within churches goes undetected or unreported. Now, reasons for this are several, and I'll just name a few. First, there may be a reluctance on the part of victims to report incidents to authorities for fear of being seen as disloyal to their community or group. Often, victims hold the belief that the problem can be solved within the group, and that really it's unnecessary to bring negative outside attention to the organization. Second, victims sometimes tend to believe that their perpetrators may have a change of heart and return misappropriated funds. And finally, some victims simply refuse to accept the objectionable actions of people that they tend to admire or look up to. As one church member who knew they had been embezzled stated, quote, "I know he stole my money, but I still think he's a wonderful person." Owing to time, this presentation does not even begin to touch on those organizations that charge adherence fees for either higher knowledge or for the privilege of working in the orbit of these leaders. But in all these cases, together with those outlined in this presentation, it remains that religious organizations and groups offer a profitable venue for fraudsters to separate money from believers. Thank you very much. I will now hand it over to Professor Lord.
Hi, so as Steve mentioned, my name is Phil. I am a law professor here at the Boral Alaskan Faculty of Law in Thunder Bay, Ontario, Canada. And then the limited time that we have today, I just wanted to develop kind of a brief taxonomy of the types of religious fraud, some of which Steve alludes to in his presentation, and try to describe the various ways in which we might use that label, which is pretty broad, and how they might warrant a different kind of legal characterization. So the first label that I used on there is what I would call religious fraud, which is fraud having to do with getting people to adhere to a religion, which Steve dedicated a pretty significant portion of his presentation to. I include in that a number of kind of sub-aspects that all relate to people essentially lying to get other people to adhere to their religion. So first one is just lies, so misrepresentations of various facts, generally by religious founders. So saying that they've experienced certain things when they know that it's not true, right? And that goes to the sincerity of the belief, which is a criterion that we see in various court cases, but that generally doesn't apply in that context, at least not in the United States. So misstating various experiences that they've had without having sincerity as to that, right? So they can have an experience that's subjectively not true, right? It's not sufficient, but when they start misrepresenting that, right, that would be what we would call a lie or fraud. So that's an example of a lie that gets people to adhere to religion. So founder says they've experienced something, and as a result of that, someone ends up joining the religion, and then later on they claim that if that misstatement had not been made, they would not have joined the religion. And more broadly, if we take a bit of a step back before we continue, it's generally how we define fraud. So fraud has an aspect of a misstatement, so a statement of fact that is not true. Someone stating something as though it were, again, objectively true, a fact that turns out not to be true. And then there's an element of harm. So there's an element of a person undergoing a loss, and that is the second kind of criterion for fraud. So again, someone later on comes in and says, I've been lied to, and as a result of that, I've incurred various damages by joining the religion. Related category, which Steve also mentioned in his presentation, is misattribution, which is related, because it's essentially a misstatement. So various religious objects is an example that Steve mentioned, or just certain statements as to how certain events should be attributed, generally again by a religious founder, for the purpose of getting people to believe, So statement as to religious artifact that having certain divine attributes or having been received in a certain context. For example, the Mormon Church believes in certain plates being shown to the prophet by an angel, and then the characterization again of that object, getting people to adhere to a certain religion. And the last category I put on there is credential fraud, again related, often relates to a founder making representations as to certain credentials that they have, generally degrees, that turns out not to be true. And again, Scientology is an example there. So the founder is on record in various places misstating certain of his credentials. So misstating, for example, his experience in the private sector, his experience in the army, and his university degree. So pretending that he has a degree in form of engineering, which isn't true, and pretending that he has doctorates of various types, which is also not true. The one doctorate he had was essentially from a diploma mill. But again, same example, doesn't directly relate to a religious belief of the founder because they know it's not true. So they're making a misstatement not because they believe it's true, but knowing that it's not true. And then that in turn gets other people to believe in the religion. So it misleads them, and then they claim that they've undergone a loss. This whole category generally is not legally cognizable. So whichever one it is, it's generally not sufficient for someone to be able to get compensation. So they might be able to show a loss. They might be able to show that they've lost money or lost productivity or time by having to adhere to religion. They might be able to show that that flows from a misstatement from a person, generally the founder. That's generally not sufficient because courts are prevented in the United States from assessing the nature of the belief, and oftentimes that is a sufficient broader sphere of autonomy that prevents them from getting to the point where they would be able to assess whether or not the statement is true or not, and again, whether or not it is sincere. So whether or not the founder actually believed what they were saying when they were making a statement that turned out to be not true. The one limit that we see to the various protections that exist in religious organizations is criminalized behavior. And that's something that I've addressed in some earlier presentations at the conference in earlier years. And it's a pretty hard limit that courts are not reluctant to enforce. So criminal behavior is not covered in the various exemptions. So there are ways for members of certain religions to do things that otherwise would be illegal. And that generally does not include criminalized behavior, right? So they're allowed to not get a license to engage in a certain activity when they otherwise would have to. They're allowed to not pay taxes when they otherwise would have to, right? These are examples of things that are legal, but where there's an exemption for a person or a group because of religious reasons. That does not extend, as I said, to criminalized behavior. So, for example, assault. So, if someone assaults someone else, it's not covered by religious belief. Another example that we addressed earlier in last year's conference is Scientology's rehabilitation project force. So Scientology had or has most likely had essentially a private prison where it would enforce religious doctrine by punishing people. So it would enforce religious doctrine by getting people to engage in forced labor or by getting other people to assault them. That is not covered because it's a criminal act and therefore falls without the scope of that protection. And that is true, right, both organizationally and at the individual level. So if individuals engaged in criminal activity, then they can be prosecuted for that, and there's no religious exemption to it. And same thing for an organization. That's more rare, right? Because organizations act through people, but to the extent that you can show that the action itself is attributable to the organization, so either it's systemic or the person is acting in their capacity as a representative of the religion, as opposed to in their personal capacity, and that's attributed to the organization. And it can be, again, right, prosecuted if that's criminalized behavior. Nonetheless, there's what we call prosecutorial discretion. So even when, right, there's potentially sufficient evidence to try to prosecute someone, so to try to show that they've committed a crime, try to prove that in court, prosecutors have discretions. They can choose not to do that. They evaluate the public interest in various ways in assessing that. So they assess whether or not, right, it's good to put, say, marginalized people in jail, even though they might have committed a crime, right? That's one example. And they retain that broad discretion. And we often see that discretion being exercised in a way that tries not to charge religious organizations, particularly with crime. So individuals, right, not as much of a problem, but religious organization prosecutors, even though they might have the evidence, are very, very reluctant to pursue these kinds of cases for a bunch of reasons. Oftentimes, they're elected actors in some way, or they're nominated by someone who has a certain political affiliation. They might be concerned about the public backlash from looking like they're going after a religious organization. And there are also kind of systemic consequences to it, because as you can imagine, you can't put a religion in jail, as you cannot put a corporation in jail. It essentially means that if there's a conviction, it ceases to exist, which has, right, all the systemic consequences on the various people who adhere to the religion. The category that's a bit more, that's a bit harder to define, and that sometimes, but not always, will attract liability is what I call civil fraud. So fraud that does not fall within the two broader categories that I just mentioned. So that is not for the purpose of getting people to adhere to a religion, generally by the founder. That's what I labeled religious fraud, and that does not directly engage criminalized behavior. So behavior that is otherwise illegal, that causes damage, but that is not criminal in nature. And I would split that into two kind of subcategories. First one is by members, and second one is by the organization. So by members is more usual, and it really moves significantly away from the religious context, such that religion ceases to have relevance to assessing whether or not there's been a violation. And as a result of that, it's going to attract liability. So if you have people lying to each other within a somewhat religious context, but it's a private interaction, right? So there's victim, then there's person that profits, then that will be illegal under civil laws, even if it's not criminal, might also be criminal, and then courts will also be able to prosecute. Prosecutors will also be able to bring these cases kind of dually, right? So both in a civil and a criminal court. We often call that affinity fraud, which is even less religious in nature. So that's just people using certain social bonds that they have as a result of their religious affiliation to engage in fraudulent behavior, again, at the civil level. So we've seen a lot of Ponzi schemes that were marketed to members of a certain religion. That the Madoff Ponzi scheme was notorious for having a large number of Jewish victims, including very high-profile Jewish victims, including Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel. So Madoff was a member of a country club where there was a significant number of Jewish members, and he used his own religious affiliation to recruit people as part of his Ponzi scheme. So again, there's a religious component in that, right? People might trust him because he is Jewish. He might have that bond as a result of his religious affiliation, right? Cement them within a religious service, for example, but the behavior itself is not religious, right? Having an investment fund is not religious. Using these funds for illegitimate purposes, right, to defraud people is not religious, and therefore courts are not reluctant to engage in that, and that kind of behavior will be criminalized. It's also true at the organizational level, but it's something that we see very rarely. So if you had something similar, if you had a church that got a person to invest in something by making representations that are not true, then the courts would ostensibly be just as willing to engage with that, right, to outlaw it, as they would with individuals for exactly the same reasons. That doesn't happen often, right? Because generally churches don't engage in non-religious behavior, right? They don't run Ponzi schemes, they don't run investment funds, they don't ask people to enter into contracts with them for non-religious purposes. So it doesn't happen very often. But there is a case with Scientology, which I think is a good example, where someone was claiming essentially that. And Scientology is very unique in that it doesn't have a general donation system, right? So donations, of course, are not likely not in themselves to fraud because of the nature of donation, right? If you're making a donation, you're doing that without expecting anything in exchange. And by definition, it's therefore hard to lie to you in a way that would induce you to make that donation because, again, you're doing it, right, with liberal intent. Scientology is different because people pay for services. And the allegation was that Mr. Garcia, who brought the case, paid for services and did not receive them. That's one thing. The other thing he said is they got him to donate money by getting something in exchange, right? So saying he was paying for essentially the cross on a building, it's an oversimplification. That's basically it. And it was not true, right? So they had already got someone else to pay for the cross, or they were getting more money than the cross was worth on the building. As a result of that, right, there's a misstatement. So he didn't get what he was told he was going to get for his money, or if it's a donation, right, it was made based on a representation of fact that is not true. And again, that is not religious, and that's why it doesn't fall under the first kind of bucket that we address as religious fraud. So it's not saying, right, this thing is going to give you eternal salvation. Right? That would be a statement as to a religious practice to get him to adhere to the religion. That would not be something that courts would accept to engage with him. But if they say, right, your money is going to go to pay for the cross, then that is not religious in nature as a statement, and potentially that attracts liability. In that case, it did not work because Scientology had a way to get out of that, again, ostensibly at first illegal practice by having binding religious arbitration. Without getting into that in too much detail, because it's something I've spoken on at length in earlier years, right? Arbitration in general is just a system through which people make a voluntary decision not to subject themselves to the court system. So they make a voluntary decision not to go to court, which otherwise they have a right to, generally a constitutional right to. So hence why, right, they have to agree, and everyone has to agree. and instead they give their dispute to someone else, who could be just anyone, could be someone who's not a judge, could be a religious minister, whatever the contract says, to make a binding decision on it, which is to say to make a final decision in a similar way as a court would, a decision that's just as final, and then you have certain laws within the regular justice system that allow you to enforce that, right? So that allow you to turn that arbitral award, is what we call it, so that non-court judgment into a court judgment, which gives you the rights that you otherwise would have, namely generally to show up in people's houses and seize their stuff if they don't pay you voluntarily. So Scientology has a contract that subjects its members to binding religious arbitration. So that says if you're going to claim something, anything, right, that's how broad the contract is, that otherwise would allow you to go to court in the civil sense, just like my fraud example, right, misstatement as to he was paying for the cross, then you have to go to binding religious arbitration. Contract says you cannot go to the court system. You instead have to go to this other person, which turns out to be a panels of Scientologists who turn out to have a religious rule that says if they rule in favor of the person suing Scientology, they'll get kicked out. Okay, I'm oversimplifying things, but that's the basic problem. And so, as you can imagine, right, probably means that Mr. Garcia, who's suing for his money back, is not going to win. So religious arbitration is a way to expand that sphere of independence, because there are things that I mentioned in this presentation that are, right, by default not subject to a legal claim, where the religion or the person cannot get sued either civilly or criminally. When something might allow them to be sued, religious arbitration is a way for them to extend that independence, to withdraw from, right, the ability of the court to assert its jurisdiction over them, and as a result of that, essentially, right, be able to have independence that they otherwise would not have. Just three additional things briefly that didn't kind of neatly fall in these buckets are certain things generally that are made mandatory by statutes, which is to say by laws, right? Not by the Constitution and not by the common law, which are the rules that the judges made up where there were no statutes. Okay, so there's a law that says something is illegal. And then unless there's a specific exemption for religion, the religion generally has to respect that. And we see that in the context of taxation statute, financial disclosure statutes, and certain medical disclosure statutes. And to the extent that there is a violation of these statutes, and there is no exemption for religious purposes, which generally, again, there is not, then these organizations, right, the religious organization or the specific person will be able to be subject to the court's jurisdiction, which is to say, right, they'll be able to get sued, generally for money. So taxation first, there's various exemptions that exist for religious organizations, which is to say, religions often do not have to pay taxes. It's something they have to apply for. Unlike the constitutional protection, it doesn't just apply once you're a religion. You have to apply for it. You have to meet certain criteria having to do with, right, not enriching specific people, and therefore not being to the profit of the public good. But to the extent that, right, religion is subject to certain taxation reporting, so for example, religion has an investment arm, right, or holds certain assets, that corporation is not exempt from disclosure, then it has to respect it. And if there's a misstatement, then that's potentially tax fraud. Just to say again, right, a statement of fact that is not true under the statute, and that could be true for individual as well. For example, in the instance I just mentioned of enriching a specific individual. Financial disclosure is another interesting issue that we've seen a lot more intensely in recent years, especially with religions that have large amounts of money that they invest. And there are financial disclosure statutes that apply anyway. So in my earlier example, say the organization is exempt from taxation. So they don't have to report things to the IRS or the government agency for the purpose of being assessed certain taxes. There is still a statute that will say if you're managing more than X dollars, then you have to tell another government agency, Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, right? Different in some other countries. In the United States, it's the SEC. You have to tell them what it is that you own and how much money you're managing if you're past a certain threshold. Again, no reason why a religious organization would be exempt from that. The statute does not say that, doesn't have an exception in it, and therefore, religious organization needs to respect that. And to the extent that they don't, then they'll be sued. And we saw that very recently this year or last year with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the commonly known as the Mormon Church, where essentially they did not disclose that. So they had certain entities, right, investment companies that managed more than the maximum amount, and they did not tell the government on the form that they had to fill, and so they were sued, right? And they actually settled that, so they admitted some form of wrongdoing, paid a relatively nominal fine, I think it was $5 million, to the government for that omission. And that case, if you're interested, is particularly interesting because there is an allegation that that's for donation purposes, right? Essentially for the religion to enrich itself. So the Mormon Church has tithing, which is mandatory donation. So it tells its members, you have to give us 10% of the money you're making per year. And as a result of that, has become extremely wealthy, has something in the vicinity of $100 million, previously thought to be 40, $100 billion. So that's $100,000 million. And so as you can imagine, right, that might get some members who do not make that much money to start thinking that perhaps a religion does not need 10% of their income if it has that much money, right, stashed away, that it's just investing in hotels or whatever other assets they hold for the purpose of increasing the value of their investment portfolio. And the allegation was essentially that. It was essentially that they did not tell the government how much money they were managing, even when they had to, because they wanted to get out of paying, right, of having their members choose not to donate money. And finally, medical claims, which is also something that's regulated by statute. So there will be restriction on what we call food and drugs, so things that either people eat or things that people eat for the purpose of trying to cure them. And there's very stringent regulation, first because it's something you put in your body, and second because it's something that you can sell for a lot of money for the purpose of, right, treating people. We want to make sure that it works. That's where the line between faith and science becomes relevant, right? So generally claims made by religion are not meant to be objective, which is one of the reasons why they don't attract generally, right, a claim of fraud under my first category. Right? It's meant to be believed, not necessarily because there's an objective basis for it, not because you can scientifically prove that it's true, simply because it's asserted. That's faith, right? But to the extent that religion does something different, so it starts saying, right, factual things. So it starts saying this will cure, right, X illness, that is a claim of a medical nature. And to the extent it's not true, right, it doesn't meet, right, asserted benefit, then that religious organization will be subject to legal liability. So again, it's civil in these three examples because it's in violation of a statute. So that said, I hope that was helpful. So these are categories that we can use, and I think they kind of help delineate first what we mean by fraud, right? Because there's religious aspects to each of the points I mentioned in a different way. So what we mean by religious fraud, and again, the extent to which it might attract legal liability.